The city never forgets a patient man. It remembers the loud ones, the violent ones, the men who grabbed power like drowning men grab air. But the patient man? He waits in the shadows, watching empires built on speed crumble into dust. This is the story of Leonard Castellano, a man who understood something most criminals never do, that power isn't taken, it's cultivated. Over 25 years, while bosses rose and fell, while territories changed hands in blood-soaked nights, Leonard waited. He planted seeds in silence, nurtured alliances in darkness, and when the time finally came, his empire emerged not with gunfire, but with inevitability. Comment where you're watching from and the time you see this. Because right now, somewhere in America, there's another patient man waiting, watching, learning from the mistakes of those who moved too fast. Don't forget to like this video if you appreciate stories that show the real price of power, the years, the sacrifice, the slow corruption of the soul. Subscribe for more Mafia stories that go beyond the violence to explore the psychology, the patience, and the paranoia that defines the American underworld. Share this with your loved ones so they understand that in life, as in crime, the fastest route to power is often the quickest path to ruin. Now, let's go back to 1978, to a cold November night in Philadelphia, to a young man standing outside an Italian restaurant called Vittorio's, watching through steamed windows as men in expensive suits carved up the city like a Thanksgiving turkey. Leonard Castellano was 23 years old, and he was hungry. But not the kind of hunger that burns hot and fast. The kind that settles deep in your bones and stays there, patient and cold, for decades. Leonard grew up in South Philadelphia, in a neighborhood where loyalty was currency and silence was survival. His father, Raymond Castellano, ran a legitimate trucking company, legitimate in the sense that the tax record said so, though everyone knew half the loads that moved through those warehouses never appeared on any manifest. Raymond wasn't a made man. He existed in that gray territory between the straight world and the life, servicing the families without belonging to them, making enough to raise his family, but never enough to attract attention. "Keep your head down," Raymond told his son 1,000 times. The men who reach for the sky end up buried in the ground. Leonard listened. He worked in his father's warehouse, loading trucks, keeping books, learning the rhythms of the business. But at night he watched. He studied the men who came through, the enforcers and the lieutenants, the way they carried themselves, the way they spoke in code that wasn't really code at all. He learned their patterns, their hierarchies, their weaknesses. In 1979, he met Anthony Russo. Tony was a soldier in the Benedetto family, one of 3 major organizations operating in Philadelphia at the time. Tony wasn't smart, but he was connected, and he liked the young Castellano. They'd drink together at a bar called The Anchor, a place where working guys mixed with made guys, where the line between the two worlds blurred after enough whiskey. "You ever think about getting involved?" Tony asked one night, his words loose with alcohol. "You got the temperament for it. You don't talk too much. You notice things." Leonard smiled, that careful smile he'd perfected. "I think about a lot of things, Tony. But thinking and doing are different animals." "Philosophy," Tony laughed. "You sound like my old man. Just remember, kid, this life, you're either in it or you're watching it. There's no middle ground that lasts." But Leonard believed there was. He believed you could exist in the space between learning, waiting, building relationships without commitments, gathering information like a miser hoards gold. For 4 years, from 1978 to 1982, that's exactly what he did. He became valuable without becoming visible. When the Benedetto family needed to move product through legitimate channels, Raymond's trucking company was available. When they needed someone to hold money for a few days, someone not officially connected, Leonard could do that. When they needed information about a rival family's operations, the young man who drank in the same bars and ate in the same diners could listen. He never asked for much. A small percentage. Enough to seem reasonable, never enough to seem greedy. And he never, ever pushed for more. In the warehouse, Leonard worked alongside men like Frank DeLuca, a veteran loader who'd been moving merchandise, both legal and otherwise, for 20 years. Frank taught him which drivers could be trusted, which cops could be bought, which neighborhoods were safe, and which were powder kegs waiting to explode. The secret, Frank said one afternoon, smoking a cigarette by the loading dock, is knowing when to move and when to stay still. I've seen 100 guys your age try to rush things. They're all either dead or in prison. Leonard nodded, filing away every word like precious intelligence. In 1982, the first of many wars erupted. The Benedetto family and the Torino family went to war over control of the port unions. It was ugly, fast, and decisive. 7 men died in 3 weeks. The Benedettos won, but their victory was expensive. 2 captains dead, 1 in prison, their boss, Salvatore Benedetto, forced into semi-retirement by a stroke brought on by stress. Leonard watched men his age, soldiers who'd been made for only a year or 2, get promoted to positions of authority because there was no one else left. He watched Jimmy Paradiso, barely 25, become a capo overnight. He watched Michael Costello, a hothead with more ambition than brains, take over 3 crew operations. He watched them strut and preen, enjoying their new power, making decisions based on ego rather than strategy. He remained exactly where he was. Loading trucks. Keeping books. Listening. Tony Russo survived the war and got promoted to capo. His first act was to bring Leonard in officially, to make him an associate of the Benedetto family. "It's time," Tony said, shaking his hand in the back room of Vittorio's. "You've proven yourself. You're with us now." Leonard accepted. But he'd learned something crucial from watching that war. Power acquired through violence is power that must be maintained through violence. And violence attracts attention from rivals, from law enforcement, from ambitious subordinates who see weakness in every wound. He decided then, in 1983, that his path would be different. He would build power not through force, but through indispensability. Not through fear, but through utility. Not by taking, but by becoming impossible to do without. It would take time. Years. Maybe decades. Leonard Castellano was willing to wait. The mid-80s brought cocaine to Philadelphia in quantities that transformed the entire landscape of organized crime. Money that used to flow in thousands now flowed in hundreds of thousands. Men who controlled street corners suddenly controlled neighborhoods. And with that money came violence, paranoia, and opportunity. Leonard watched crews tear themselves apart over distribution rights. He watched the Torino family split into 2 factions after their boss, Carlo Torino, was murdered by his own nephew, a kid named Dominic who thought old-fashioned loyalty was for old-fashioned times. He watched the Benedetto family struggle to adapt, with conservative capos like his sponsor Tony Russo arguing for caution, while younger soldiers like Jimmy Paradiso pushed for expansion. But Leonard didn't push. Instead, he solved problems. When the Benedetto family needed to launder money through legitimate businesses, Leonard suggested his father expand the trucking company into waste management. Garbage contracts were perfect, steady, Predictable revenue that could absorb irregular cash flows without raising suspicion. Raymond was reluctant, but his son had become the primary breadwinner, and the money was too good to refuse. Within a year, Castellano Sanitation Services was operating in 3 counties, employing 40 people, and generating enough legitimate revenue to make the criminal proceeds nearly invisible. When disputes arose between crews over territory, Leonard became the mediator. He had no stake in the outcomes, no crew of his own to protect, no ego requiring victory. He could be trusted to be fair because he had nothing to gain from being unfair, at least, nothing obvious. Marco Delgado, a capo in the Benedetto family who controlled the northern neighborhoods, came to rely on these mediation sessions. "You got a gift, kid," Marco told him in 1985, sitting in the office of the sanitation company. "You make people feel heard. In this life, that's rarer than you'd think." "People just want respect," Leonard replied. "Give them that, they'll give you room to operate." But he was doing more than mediating. Every dispute gave him insight into the operations of multiple crews. Every conversation revealed debts, alliances, weaknesses, and opportunities. He was building a mental map of the entire Philadelphia underworld, understanding not just who controlled what, but why they controlled it and how fragile that control really was. In 1986, he met Polly Brescia, an accountant who worked for several of the families, managing their books, finding creative ways to hide income and minimize tax exposure. Polly was in his 50s, cautious, and deeply paranoid about getting caught. He'd watched too many men go to prison not for murder but for tax evasion, and he was determined not to join them. Leonard cultivated the relationship carefully. He'd ask Polly questions about business structures, about corporate law, about the mechanics of financial crime. Not the crude stuff, how to hide cash in a mattress, but the sophisticated methods. Shell companies, offshore accounts, real estate investment trusts, charitable foundations. "You're smarter than most of these guys," Polly told him one evening, reviewing the books for Castellano Sanitation. "You actually want to understand how it works instead of just spending the money." "Money you understand lasts," Leonard said. "Money you just spend disappears." By 1987, Leonard had become indispensable to the Benedetto family's financial operations. He wasn't a soldier. He deliberately avoided getting made, despite Tony Russo's encouragement. Being a made man meant obligations, visibility, and vulnerability. Associates had flexibility. They could work with multiple families, maintain legitimate businesses, and stay below the radar of law enforcement's most intense scrutiny. But his caution frustrated some. Jimmy Paradiso, now a powerful capo controlling much of the family's cocaine distribution, confronted him one night at the Anchor. "What's your game, Castellano?" Jimmy demanded, drunk and aggressive. "You've been around for almost 10 years. You make money for everybody. But you won't take the oath." "Why?" Leonard looked at him calmly. "I'm more useful to the family where I am." "More useful or more safe?" Jimmy sneered. "Sounds to me like you want all the benefits without any of the risks." "I run businesses that employ made men," Leonard replied evenly. "I launder money for captains. I mediate disputes that would otherwise turn violent. If that's not taking risks, I don't know what is. But if you think I should get made, I'll talk to Tony about it." Jimmy backed down, but the resentment remained. Leonard noted it, filed it away, and continued exactly as before. He understood something Jimmy didn't. In an organization built on hierarchy and tradition, the man who refuses the throne can sometimes wield more power than the man who wears it. Because the king is always a target. But the advisor? The facilitator? The indispensable middleman? He survives regime changes. In 1988, federal indictments hit the Benedetto family hard. A RICO case brought by ambitious prosecutors took down 13 members, including 2 capos. Tony Russo was arrested at his home at dawn, charged with racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. The investigation had lasted 3 years. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, the government had built an airtight case. Leonard watched it unfold with cold fascination. He'd been careful, always communicating in person, never on phones, always maintaining the fiction that his businesses were legitimate. His name appeared nowhere in the indictments. Tony Russo went to prison for 18 years. Before he left, he met with Leonard one last time in the visitor's room at the Federal Detention Center. "Take care of my crew," Tony said. "They'll need someone to look after them while I'm gone." "I'm not a maid guy, Tony. I can't." "I'm not asking you to be a capo," Tony interrupted. "I'm asking you to be what you've always been. The guy who solves problems. The guy who keeps things running. Can you do that?" Leonard nodded. "I can do that." "Good. Because I made you, kid. You were nothing when I found you. Now you're something. Don't forget that." Leonard didn't forget. But he also didn't let gratitude cloud his judgment. Tony Russo had sponsored him, yes. But Tony had also been sloppy, talking on phones that were tapped, meeting with informants he should have suspected, letting ambition override caution. Leonard would not make those mistakes. The late 80s taught him that law enforcement was the ultimate predator in this ecosystem, patient and methodical, building cases over years while criminals focused on quarterly profits. Survival meant thinking like a prosecutor, understanding how evidence was gathered, how cases were built, and staying several steps ahead. By 1988, 10 years into his journey, Leonard Castellano controlled nothing and influenced everything. He had no crew, no territory, no official title. But he had relationships, information, and legitimate businesses that generated both legal income and criminal opportunity. And he was still hungry, still patient, still waiting. The 90s arrived with the Soviet Union collapsing, the Cold War ending, and American law enforcement redirecting massive resources toward organized crime. RICO statutes that had been experimental in the 80s became routine in the 90s. Informants who once faced death for cooperation now entered witness protection and testified openly. The old rules, omerta, loyalty unto death, blood before everything, were eroding. Leonard watched families that had existed for 50 years disintegrate in months. He watched bosses flip on subordinates to reduce sentences. He watched sons testify against fathers. The mythology of the life, the romantic notion of honor among thieves, revealed itself as exactly that, mythology. But chaos creates opportunity for those patient enough to recognize it. With Tony Russo in prison and his crew leaderless, Leonard stepped into the vacuum not as a boss, but as a manager. He kept the gambling operations running, the loan sharking current, the union connections maintained. He did it quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. When disputes arose, he mediated. When money was short, he fronted it from his legitimate businesses. When someone needed to disappear for a while, heat from cops, heat from rivals, Leonard's trucking and sanitation companies could provide employment, alibis, and cover. He became the glue holding fractured pieces together. In 1990, he met Walter Kowalski, a detective in the Philadelphia Police Department's organized crime unit. The meeting wasn't by chance. Leonard had cultivated it through intermediaries, through careful placement at certain restaurants and bars, through the kind of orchestrated coincidence that looks completely natural. They met at a diner called Rosie's, Neutral Territory, a place where cops and criminals both ate breakfast and pretended not to notice each other. "You're Castellano," Walter said, sliding into the booth across from him. "And you're the detective who's been asking questions about my sanitation contracts." Walter smiled. "Just doing my job. Making sure everything's legitimate." "Everything is," Leonard replied. "You're welcome to examine any records you want. We run a clean operation." "Clean," Walter repeated. Interesting word choice for a guy who's been spotted with half the Benedetto family. "I know a lot of people." "That's not illegal." They talked for an hour. Not about crimes or investigations, but about the neighborhood, about changes in the city, about how things used to be versus how they were now. It was a dance, each man probing the other's boundaries, testing for weakness, looking for leverage. Leonard understood that law enforcement wasn't monolithic. There were honest cops and corrupt ones, ambitious prosecutors and lazy ones, federal agents and local detectives with different priorities and different pressures. Understanding these distinctions meant knowing where the real threats lived and where accommodation might be possible. He never tried to bribe Walter Kowalski. That would have been crude and counterproductive. Instead, he made himself useful in small ways. Information about a robbery crew operating in the detective's precinct. A tip about where stolen merchandise might be recovered. Nothing that compromised his own operations, but enough to establish a relationship based on pragmatic cooperation rather than antagonism. "You're playing a dangerous game," Walter told him during one of their occasional conversations in 1992. "You're smart enough to stay out of prison, but you're not smart enough to stay out of this life." "Maybe I'm exactly smart enough," Leonard replied. "Smart enough to know where the lines are and smart enough not to cross them." "The lines move," Walter warned. "What's legal today might be a felony tomorrow. And when that happens, your cleverness won't save you." Leonard took the warning seriously. He began restructuring his businesses, creating additional layers of separation between his legitimate operations and criminal activities. He brought in outside accountants, not connected guys like Polly Brescia, but actual legitimate firms that would provide credibility if questions were ever asked. By 1993, Castellano Sanitation Services had expanded into 3 states, employed over 200 people, and was being courted by a private equity firm interested in acquiring mid-sized waste management companies. Leonard sold 40% of the company for $6 million, keeping majority control, but bringing in outside investors who had no idea about the company's origins or its secondary functions. That money, clean and documented, went into real estate. Apartment buildings in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Commercial properties in Baltimore. Each purchase legitimate, each generating taxable income, each creating additional opportunities to absorb and launder criminal proceeds. The trucking company, meanwhile, expanded into logistics and warehousing. With manufacturing moving overseas and imports flooding American ports, the need for domestic distribution networks exploded. Leonard positioned his company at that intersection, moving legitimate goods 90% of the time and occasionally accommodating special shipments, untaxed cigarettes, stolen electronics, products that fell off trucks, the remaining 10%. In 1994, Salvatore Benedetto died. The old boss had been in semi-retirement since his stroke in 1982, but his death created a succession crisis. The family's hierarchy was depleted, so many made men in prison, so many dead, so many turned informant. The remaining capos included Jimmy Paradiso, now in his late 30s and openly ambitious, Marco Delgado, conservative and cautious, and a relative newcomer named Richard Fontana, who'd risen quickly by being more ruthless than smart. They met to choose a new boss. Leonard wasn't invited, he still wasn't a made man. But all three capos came to him separately in the weeks before the meeting, each seeking his support, each asking him to use his influence with the others. "You back me, I'll make you a capo," Jimmy Paradiso promised. "You've earned it. Support my claim and your businesses will have total protection," Marco Delgado offered. "No interference, no tribute, complete autonomy." "I need your financial networks," Richard Fontana said bluntly. "Help me consolidate power, and we'll make more money than you've ever imagined." Leonard listened to all three. He made promises to none of them. Instead, he suggested something different, a commission. Rather than one boss, why not have a ruling council? Three capos, equal authority, decisions made collectively. It would prevent any single point of failure, distribute risk, and maintain balance. "That's not how it works," Jimmy objected. "There's always been one boss. And how many of those bosses are dead or in prison?" Leonard countered. "Maybe it's time to try something different. Something that reflects the reality of what we've become." They were skeptical, but they were also afraid. Afraid of the other two gaining absolute power. Afraid of making a move that would trigger another war. Afraid that any choice would be the wrong one. In the end, they agreed to Leonard's proposal. A three-man commission. Equal votes. Major decisions requiring unanimous consent. It was unwieldy and dysfunctional, exactly as Leonard intended. Because a fractured leadership needed a mediator, a neutral party who could broker compromises and maintain equilibrium. That mediator was Leonard Castellano. By 1995, 17 years into his journey, he'd achieved something remarkable. He controlled the Benedetto family without being part of it. He held no official position, commanded no soldiers, bore no traditional title. But every significant decision flowed through him. Every dispute required his mediation. Every financial transaction needed his approval. He was the shadow boss of an organization that didn't even realize it had one. And he was still hungry. Still patient. Still building. The late 90s brought unprecedented economic growth to America. The stock market soared. Real estate values climbed. Money was everywhere, and people who knew how to move it, how to hide it, how to make it appear and disappear, were invaluable. Leonard Castellano had spent nearly 2 decades building expertise in exactly that. His legitimate businesses thrived. Castellano Sanitation, now operating in 6 states, went public in 1997. Leonard retained 30% ownership and stepped back from day-to-day operations, installing professional management and a corporate board. The company's stock price tripled in 2 years, making him wealthy on paper in ways that had nothing to do with crime. The trucking and logistics operations merged with 2 competitors, forming a regional powerhouse called Northeast Transport Solutions. Again, Leonard maintained significant ownership while bringing in outside capital and management. To anyone examining his finances, law enforcement, investors, tax authorities, he looked like a successful entrepreneur who'd built businesses from nothing and ridden the economic boom to fortune. The reality was more complex, but complexity provided cover. With the Benedetto family's commission structure proving chaotic, Leonard quietly began cultivating relationships with other families. Not to betray the Benedettos, but to create redundancy, to ensure that if one organization collapsed, his interests wouldn't collapse with it. In Atlantic City, he connected with the Moretti organization through a mutual acquaintance named Sonny Battaglia, who ran casino junket operations. Sonny needed ways to move money offshore, to hide profits from both tax authorities and his own bosses. Leonard's network of shell companies and international accounts could facilitate that. In New York, he developed a relationship with Nicholas Grimaldi, a consigliere to one of the 5 families who appreciated sophisticated financial strategies over crude violence. Nicholas introduced him to opportunities in construction kickbacks, union pension fund manipulation, and no-show job schemes that generated millions with minimal risk. In Baltimore, through a connection with Thomas Ricci, a labor racketeer, Leonard gained access to port operations and stevedore unions, creating new channels for importing goods, both legal and otherwise, with minimal scrutiny. Each relationship was carefully calibrated. He never became indispensable to any single organization, never created dependency that would make him a target. Instead, he made himself useful to many, a connector who could solve problems across jurisdictional boundaries, who could move money between cities and between families without triggering territorial disputes. "You're building something none of us have seen before," Nicholas Grimaldi told him in 1999, sitting in the back of a car parked near the Hudson River. "You're not a boss. You're not even made. But you're connected to everybody." "What do you call that?" "I call it survival," Leonard replied. "I call it ambitious," Nicholas countered. "And ambition makes people nervous." The warning was clear. Leonard was accumulating too much influence, becoming too visible to too many people. In a world built on clear hierarchies and territorial boundaries, his boundary-crossing role was anomalous, and anomalies attracted attention. He responded by pulling back slightly, delegating more, using intermediaries to maintain relationships rather than handling everything personally. He cultivated younger associates, men like Danny Covello, who worked in his logistics company, Terry Marchetti, who managed some of his real estate holdings, and Alan Priestley, who handled legal issues through a small law firm that specialized in corporate structure. These men became his buffers, his operational layer, handling day-to-day interactions while Leonard remained increasingly distant from the street-level operations. In 2001, the September 11th attacks transformed American law enforcement priorities. Resources that had been focused on organized crime shifted dramatically toward counterterrorism. The pressure that had been building throughout the 90s, the aggressive RICO prosecutions and informant cultivation, eased slightly as federal agents were reassigned and budgets redirected. Leonard saw opportunity in the chaos. While families celebrated what they thought was breathing room, he understood it was temporary. The infrastructure for surveillance, the legal frameworks for prosecution, the institutional knowledge within law enforcement, none of that had disappeared. It was just pointed elsewhere for a moment. He used that moment to restructure everything. His criminal operations, the gambling and loan sharking and occasional freight hijacking, were consolidated under a single associate named Dominic Petrone. Dom was smart, cautious, and absolutely loyal, not to Leonard personally, but to the money Leonard generated. That was better than emotional loyalty, because it was predictable. His legitimate businesses were restructured as well, with Leonard's ownership increasingly held through trusts and limited liability companies, making it difficult to trace assets back to him personally. If any of his associates were arrested, if any of his operations were compromised, the legal liability would be compartmentalized, separated from his core holdings. In 2002, Jimmy Paradiso, one of the 3 capos on the Benedetto Commission, was indicted for murder. The case stemmed from a killing in 1995, a beef over territory that Jimmy had resolved with violence instead of negotiation. A witness who'd been too afraid to talk 7 years earlier had finally agreed to testify. Jimmy went to prison. The commission was down to 2 members, Marco Delgado and Richard Fontana. And their relationship, never warm, had deteriorated into barely concealed hostility. "We need a new structure," Marco told Leonard in a meeting at a construction site in South Philadelphia. "This commission thing was a mistake. We need a boss." "You want to be that boss?" Leonard asked. "I want stability. I want someone who understands that this life isn't about how tough you are. It's about how smart you are. It's about building things that last." Marco was offering Leonard the position. After 24 years, after building relationships and accumulating influence, after becoming the indispensable middleman, he was being offered what men killed for: the throne. Leonard considered it for exactly 5 seconds before declining. "I appreciate that, Marco. Truly. But I'm more valuable where I am. Make Richard the boss. Give him the title, the respect, the responsibility. And I'll do what I've always done, keep things running smoothly." "Richard's an idiot," Marco said bluntly. "Richard's ambitious and tough, which is what people expect from a boss," Leonard countered. "Let him be the face. You and I will be the brains." Marco understood immediately. A figurehead boss, someone to draw attention and take risks while the real power operated from the shadows. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Richard Fontana became boss of the Benedetto family in 2003. He lasted 18 months before a federal indictment took him down for tax evasion and wire fraud. By then, Leonard Castellano had built something more durable than any single organization, a network that transcended traditional family structures, that operated across city boundaries, that blended legitimate and criminal enterprises so thoroughly that separating them would require dismantling billions of dollars in legitimate business. He was 25 years into his journey, and he was finally ready to consolidate everything he'd built into something permanent. 25 years is a generation. Children born when Leonard Castellano first stood outside Vittorio's restaurant were now adults themselves. The world had changed, the Soviet Union had fallen, the internet had transformed communication, DNA evidence had revolutionized law enforcement. But human nature remained constant. People still wanted power, money, respect. They still betrayed each other. They still made the same mistakes. Leonard had watched it all, learned from it all, and avoided those mistakes with disciplined patience. By 2003, his empire existed in layers. The top layer was completely legitimate: publicly traded companies, real estate investment trusts, charitable foundations that genuinely helped communities while also providing tax advantages and reputation rehabilitation. Leonard Castellano was now a philanthropist, a successful businessman, someone interviewed by business journals about entrepreneurship and the American dream. The second layer was gray: businesses that were legal but existed primarily to service criminal operations. Check cashing stores that facilitated loan sharking. Equipment rental companies that provided cover for stolen goods. Consulting firms that existed only on paper but generated invoices that justified cash payments. The third layer was criminal: gambling operations, loan sharking, labor racketeering, cargo theft, and drug trafficking at the wholesale level. He'd avoided street-level narcotics, the kind of dealing that attracted police attention and destroyed neighborhoods. Instead, his operations focused on volume importation and distribution to other organizations, keeping his people several steps removed from the violence and chaos of retail drug sales. Each layer was compartmentalized. People working in the legitimate businesses had no idea they were part of a criminal enterprise. People in the gray area businesses knew enough to be useful, but not enough to be dangerous. And the criminals themselves were organized in cellular structures, each group knowing only their immediate contacts, unable to compromise the whole if captured. In 2004, Leonard created something unprecedented, a council of counselors. He brought together representatives from 6 different families across 4 cities: Philadelphia, New York, Atlantic City, and Baltimore. Not bosses who would compete for dominance, but consiglieres and senior advisors, men who understood that their power came from intelligence rather than violence. The council met quarterly, always in different locations, always in settings that appeared completely legitimate: corporate retreats, charity golf tournaments, business conferences. They discussed common problems: law enforcement pressure, territorial disputes, financial opportunities, emerging threats. "What you're building is a confederation," said Eugene De Laurentiis, a consigliere from New York with a law degree from Columbia. "It's not a family in the traditional sense. It's a network of aligned interests." "Exactly," Leonard confirmed. "Families rise and fall. Bosses get arrested or killed. But a network adapts, survives, reconstitutes itself." "And who controls this network?" asked Vincent Torello, representing interests in Atlantic City. "No one controls it," Leonard replied. "That's the point. We collaborate when it's mutually beneficial. We stay independent otherwise. No one person's downfall brings down the whole structure." It was a lie, of course. Leonard controlled it. Not through formal authority, but through the same methods he'd used for 25 years: relationships, information, financial integration. Every member of the council owed him something: a favor, a debt, access to his laundering operations, connections to his legitimate businesses. He was the center of a web that appeared to have no center. In 2005, tragedy struck his personal life. Leonard Castellano, his father, died of a heart attack at 72. The man who'd taught him patience, who'd built the trucking company that became the foundation of everything Leonard achieved, was gone. At the funeral, over 300 people attended. Legitimate businessmen, politicians, union leaders, and, scattered throughout the crowd in expensive suits, representatives from every major criminal organization in the Northeast. "Your father was a good man," Marco Delgado said, embracing Leonard at the wake. "He never wanted this life for you." "I know," Leonard replied quietly. "But I think he understood why I chose it." "Did you choose it? Or did it choose you?" Leonard didn't answer. He'd spent 25 years building power, but in doing so, had he built a prison? He was wealthy beyond measure, influential beyond imagining, but he couldn't walk away. Too many people depended on his systems. Too many organizations relied on his coordination. Too many secrets could unravel if he disappeared. The kingdom he'd built required a king, even if that king had never wanted the crown. In 2006, federal prosecutors announced a massive RICO case against the Moretti organization in Atlantic City. 43 indictments, including Sonny Battaglia, Leonard's original connection to that family. The case was built on 5 years of wiretaps, surveillance, and testimony from multiple cooperating witnesses. Leonard's name appeared nowhere in the indictments. His businesses weren't mentioned. But he knew that investigators had certainly encountered his operations while building their case. The fact that he remained untouched meant one of two things. Either his compartmentalization had been effective, keeping his criminal activities separated from his legitimate identity, or prosecutors had made a strategic decision to focus on more traditional targets while gathering information on his more complex operations. He assumed the latter. "They're coming for you eventually," Walter Kowalski told him during one of their increasingly rare meetings. The detective was older now, grayer, talking more about retirement than investigations. "Maybe not this year or next year. But eventually, they'll piece together what you've built." "What have I built, detective?" Leonard asked calmly. "A sanitation company? A logistics firm? Real estate holdings?" "An empire," Walter replied. "And empires attract attention." Leonard increased his distance from criminal operations. He promoted associates to handle what he'd once managed personally. He stopped attending meetings, even the quarterly council gatherings, sending representatives instead. He became a ghost in his own organization, present in influence, but absent in fact. In 2007, he sold his remaining ownership in Castellano Sanitation for $87 million. The company he'd built with his father, the foundation of everything, was now completely separate from him. It hurt emotionally, but it was necessary. Each connection to his past was a potential legal vulnerability. That same year, he moved most of his personal wealth offshore, into accounts and trusts in jurisdictions with strong privacy laws and no extradition treaties with the United States. Not to hide money from taxes, he paid those meticulously, but to protect assets from potential forfeiture if criminal charges ever materialized. By 2008, 30 years into his journey, Leonard Castellano was 53 years old. He lived in a penthouse in Philadelphia, employed a personal staff of 8, and appeared in society pages as a philanthropist and entrepreneur. He sat on the boards of 3 hospitals, 2 universities, and a museum. But he also controlled, through layers of proxies and intermediaries, a criminal network generating over $200 million annually. He influenced labor unions representing 30,000 workers. He had politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials who owed him favors or feared his knowledge of their indiscretions. He had become exactly what he'd set out to become, a man with power that no one saw coming. Because he'd waited. Because he'd been patient. Because while others grabbed for glory, he'd built infrastructure. While others sought attention, he'd cultivated invisibility. While others rushed to the top, he'd taken 25 years to climb there, step by careful step. But there was a problem. One he was only beginning to recognize. When you build an empire on patience, on delayed gratification, on sacrificing today for tomorrow, you create a fundamental question. When does tomorrow arrive? When do you stop building and start enjoying? When does the patient man allow himself to be satisfied? Leonard Castellano didn't have an answer. And that uncertainty, that inability to ever feel like enough was enough, would become his greatest vulnerability. The financial crisis of 2008 devastated legitimate markets, but created opportunities in criminal ones. When legal credit disappeared, illegal lending thrived. When businesses struggled, labor racketeering intensified. When government budgets contracted, corruption flourished. Leonard's network adapted quickly, but the crisis revealed fractures that patience had papered over but not truly healed. In Baltimore, Thomas Ricci, who controlled port operations, started skimming from the collective funds. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that careful accountants noticed discrepancies. When confronted, Thomas didn't apologize or return the money. He challenged Leonard's authority. "You're not my boss," Thomas said during a tense meeting in a warehouse near the harbor. "You never got made. You never took the oath. You're just a businessman who thinks he's a gangster." "I never claimed to be anything," Leonard replied calmly. "But I am the person who's kept this network functioning for 15 years. I'm the person who's kept you out of prison. And I'm the person who can make your entire operation disappear if you keep stealing. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact." Thomas Ricci was found dead 3 weeks later, an apparent heart attack. He was 49 years old and had no history of cardiac issues. The autopsy was inconclusive. No one in the network asked questions. Leonard had never ordered a killing before. He'd spent 30 years avoiding violence, using mediation and financial leverage instead. But Thomas had left him no choice. Backing down would have invited challenges from others, would have revealed weakness in a world where weakness was fatal. The killing disturbed him, not morally but practically. Violence was the tool of men who'd run out of other options. The fact that he'd resorted to it suggested his options were narrowing, his influence declining, his carefully built systems fracturing. In 2009, the FBI approached Danny Covello, one of Leonard's most trusted associates who managed logistics operations. They showed Danny evidence of his involvement in cargo theft, enough to send him to prison for 20 years. They offered him a deal: cooperate, testify, and walk away with probation. Danny refused. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. He went to prison without saying a word about Leonard or the network. But the attempt rattled Leonard. The FBI knew about Danny, which meant they knew about the logistics company, which meant they were building a case against the entire operation. How long before they had enough? How long before someone less loyal than Danny took the deal? He accelerated his distancing, selling more businesses, transferring ownership, creating additional layers of separation. But each layer also removed control, and without control, the network began operating independently, sometimes chaotically. In Atlantic City, after the fall of the Moretti organization, new players emerged, younger and more reckless. They resented the council structure Leonard had created, viewed it as old-fashioned, unnecessary. They wanted autonomy, territory, the freedom to operate without oversight. A crew led by Marcus Delaney began hijacking shipments that belonged to the network, selling products they should have distributed, keeping profits they should have shared. When Leonard's representatives tried to negotiate, Marcus laughed at them. "Tell Castellano I don't answer to ghosts," Marcus said. "He wants respect. He should show his face." But Leonard couldn't show his face. Visibility was exactly what he'd spent decades avoiding. Yet invisibility had created its own problem. People didn't fear someone they never saw. In 2010, federal prosecutors indicted Eugene De Laurentiis, the New York consigliere who'd been part of Leonard's counsel since its inception. Eugene was 73, in poor health, facing charges that would effectively mean dying in prison. He took a deal. He agreed to cooperate. Leonard learned about it through Walter Kowalski, who'd retired from the police, but maintained contacts in federal law enforcement. "Eugene's going to testify about the council meetings," Walter told him over coffee in a suburban diner far from Philadelphia. "They're going after the whole network. And you're at the center of it." "I never participated in those meetings directly," Leonard said. "I always sent representatives. They have financial records. They've traced money flows between organizations. They've documented coordination that could only happen through centralized planning. You might not have sat at the table, but they can prove you set the table." Leonard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: fear. Not the immediate fear of violence, but the cold dread of inevitability. After 32 years of careful planning, of compartmentalization and distance, the walls were closing in. He considered running. He had money offshore, new identities prepared, countries without extradition treaties. But running meant abandoning everything, admitting defeat, spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Instead, he did what he'd always done. He waited. Eugene De Laurentiis died of a heart attack before he could testify. 73 years old, stressed by legal proceedings, facing prison, the death was tragic but not suspicious. The prosecution's case weakened significantly without their star witness. But other cooperators emerged. Lower-level associates, men Leonard had never met, but who'd been caught in law enforcement dragnets and offered deals. They couldn't implicate Leonard directly, but they could describe systems, patterns, relationships. They could build circumstantial webs that grand juries found compelling. In 2011, Leonard's lawyers informed him that he was the target of a federal investigation. Not a suspect, not a person of interest, but a target, meaning prosecution was likely if sufficient evidence materialized. He prepared for trial. He assembled a legal team that cost $4 million annually. He reviewed every business transaction from the past decade, sanitizing records, preparing explanations, constructing alternative narratives for ambiguous activities. But he also recognized that the game had changed. The patient approach, the long-term building, the careful cultivation of relationships, all of that was designed for a world where law enforcement moved slowly and criminals could stay ahead through cleverness. But modern law enforcement didn't move slowly. They had computers that analyzed millions of transactions, artificial intelligence that identified patterns, international cooperation that traced money across borders. They had the Patriot Act and expanded surveillance authorities. They had decades of institutional knowledge about how criminal networks operated. Leonard Castellano had built an empire by being smarter than everyone else. But he couldn't outsmart technology, algorithms, and unlimited government resources. In 2012, Marco Delgado, his oldest living friend in the life, came to see him at his penthouse. "Walk away," Marco said. "You have enough money. You've won. Just walk away before they take it all." "Walk away to what?" Leonard asked. "This is all I've known for 34 years. This is all I am." "Then that's the tragedy," Marco replied sadly. "You spent your whole life building something, and you built a cage." The indictment came in January 2013. Leonard Castellano was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The indictment was 97 pages long and detailed a criminal enterprise spanning 5 states and 25 years. His lawyers assured him they could fight it. The evidence was largely circumstantial, the witnesses compromised, the financial transactions explainable through legitimate business purposes. But Leonard knew the truth. He might beat this case, but there would be another one. And another. The government didn't stop. They'd keep investigating, keep building cases, keep prosecuting until they won or he died. He'd spent 35 years accumulating power. And in a single moment, he understood that all that power was an illusion. Real power belonged to the institution, to the government, to the system that could outlast any individual, no matter how patient, no matter how clever. On a cold February morning in 2013, 35 years after he'd first stood outside Vittorio's restaurant watching men in expensive suits carve up the city, Leonard Castellano walked into federal court for his arraignment. The patience that had built his empire would now be tested in a different way, waiting in court, waiting for motions to be heard, waiting for a trial that might not happen for years, waiting to learn if his freedom would end in a prison cell. The journey had come full circle. From waiting to build power to waiting to learn if that power would destroy him. Leonard Castellano's trial lasted 7 months. The prosecution presented evidence from 42 witnesses, thousands of pages of financial documents, and hundreds of hours of surveillance footage. They built a narrative of a criminal mastermind who'd spent decades building an empire while hiding behind legitimate businesses. His defense countered with testimony from business partners, employees, and community leaders who described a philanthropist and entrepreneur, someone who'd built businesses, created jobs, and contributed to society. They argued that association wasn't crime, that knowing criminals didn't make you one, that circumstantial evidence proved nothing. The jury deliberated for 19 days. They found him guilty on 12 counts, not guilty on 8 others. The verdict was mixed enough to suggest reasonable doubt, but conclusive enough to mean prison. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Leonard's contributions to the community, his lack of violent criminal history, his age, and declining health. Then the judge sentenced him to 22 years in federal prison. Leonard was 58 years old. 22 years meant he'd be 80 before release, if he lived that long. Marco Delgado visited him in prison 6 months into his sentence. "They're dismantling everything," Marco reported. "The network's falling apart. Without you coordinating, everyone's going their own way. Some are getting arrested. Some are retiring. Some are dead." 25 years to build, Leonard said quietly. Less than 1 year to fall apart. Was it worth it? Marco asked. Leonard considered the question. He'd accumulated wealth, influence, and power. He'd outlasted countless rivals, avoided numerous investigations, built an empire that dominated the underworld of an entire region. By any objective measure, he'd succeeded. But he was in prison. He would die in prison, most likely. Everything he'd built was gone or soon would be. The relationships he'd cultivated had evaporated the moment he couldn't provide utility. The loyalty he'd inspired had proven as illusory as his power. "I don't know," Leonard finally answered. "I spent my whole life being patient, waiting for the right moment. But I never asked the right question. Patient for what? What was I waiting for? What was supposed to happen that would make all the waiting worth it?" "You wanted power," Marco said. "I wanted to matter," Leonard corrected. "I wanted to be someone. I wanted to build something that would last." "Nothing lasts," Marco replied. "Not in this life." You should have known that. Leonard had known it, theoretically. He'd watched bosses fall, families collapse, empires crumble. But he'd believed he was different, smarter, more patient. He'd believed that if he just waited long enough, planned carefully enough, built thoughtfully enough, he could be the exception. But there were no exceptions. The life consumed everyone eventually. Some quickly, through violence or careless mistakes. Others slowly, through the accumulation of tiny compromises and moral erosions that seemed insignificant until you looked back and couldn't recognize who you'd become. Leonard Castellano had spent 25 years building power, and another 10 maintaining it. 35 years of his life dedicated to accumulating something that disappeared the moment he couldn't protect it. The price of patience, he finally understood, was time itself. And time, once spent, could never be reclaimed. He thought about his father, Raymond, who'd wanted him to stay away from the life. He thought about the legitimate businesses he could have built without criminal entanglements, The family he'd never started because relationships were liabilities. The simple pleasures he delayed for later that never came. Patience was supposed to be a virtue. But patience without purpose was just wasted time dressed up as strategy. In his prison cell, looking at walls that would contain him until death, Leonard Castellano finally understood what he should have learned at 23, standing outside Vittorio's restaurant watching men in expensive suits. Power accumulated in shadow remains in shadow. Empires built in secret die in secret. And the patient man who waits 25 years to seize what he wants will spend the rest of his life regretting that he ever wanted it at all. The city forgets the patient man eventually. It has to, because patience, in a world of constant motion and violent change, is just another word for becoming invisible while time passes you by. And time, Leonard learned too late, doesn't care how patient you are. It runs out anyway.